What if every day of our lives and every single social interaction, every conversation, every text, every bus ride, every barbecue, every movie night, every high five, we are all acting like a bunch of secret communists? Welcome to Champagne Anarchism. Welcome back. A bit of a schedule change. I'm very sorry. I had originally intended this video to cover chapters 5 and 6. If you're reading along, you're a little ahead now because we're just going to confine ourselves to chapter 5. Basically, I forgot, and as I was doing the notes, I forgot that Graeber had lumped chapters 6 and 7 together quite specifically in this book, so we're going to cover those in their own video in the next video, and we're going to confine ourselves to chapter 5 today in this incredible book, David Graeber's Debt, the First 5,000 Years. So if you are following along with the reading series, you are already ahead. So today we're just going to finish off this initial section. We're talking about money, we're talking about morality, we're talking a little bit of stuff from last week, and we are going to cover chapter 5, which I think is pretty worthwhile anyway, because chapter 5 is such a big deal in this book. This is a huge synthesis of a bunch of things coming together for Graeber, so we're going to talk about all of that today. But it does mean that this video will probably be a little shorter, and the schedule will be pushed by one extra week. Hopefully not a huge deal, but that's just a little bit of a scheduling change right at the start. If you're watching this on YouTube, please don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, all of that great stuff, and check out the Patreon channel, patreon.com/Champagne Anarchism, for much more stuff out there about cool radical leftist books. So, check all of that stuff out. Quick roadmap for today is that I'm breaking this section down into 3 different parts. First, we're going to look at reciprocity. So we'll lay out why exactly reciprocity underlines our general sense of justice and why it always has. And then in the second part, we'll look at why reciprocity might not actually be at the heart of everything. This is where we're going to talk about communism and hierarchy. We're going to get into it. And then lastly, we are going to look at Graeber's understanding of debt. What actually is debt? We're going to finally settle on something that we've kind of been building to over the last 4 chapters, which is an actual definition of really what debt is and how it functions in society and how it provides a foundation for what Graeber calls kind of a middle class or bourgeois morality, in a bad way. Let's dig right in, though, and let's talk about reciprocity being justice. Now, if you have seen my favorite anime show, or one of my favorite anime shows of all time, Full Metal Alchemist, you are familiar with the idea of equivalent exchange.
Humankind cannot gain anything without first giving something in return. To obtain something of equal value must be lost.
Right? To get something, you must give something up. This is an idea of balance, and it underlines a lot of the ways that we think about morality. We talked in previous videos about how barter economies have reciprocity at their core, right? If you want shoes, you have to bake a bunch of bread to get those shoes. That is something that we can very easily conceptually grasp, right? It makes a lot of sense to us, this idea of things balancing each other out. This is our fundamental idea of justice, is all about this idea of balance. Think about the things that we say to each other on an almost daily basis, the little things that we have kind of just in our language. We say, for example, that you reap what you sow. We also say that one good turn deserves another, or that there's no such thing as a free lunch, right? You have to have given something up to get that free lunch, or you're being taken advantage of if you think that you're getting a free lunch. Then there are things tied to work ethic. You have to pay your dues. You have to earn your keep. Then there are things that are linguistically tied to our ideas of justice. An eye for an eye, quid pro quo, right? This for that, something for something else. And so our entire idea of justice is based on balance. Occasionally, it's something like cosmic balance. We talk frequently about the idea of karma. We have this kind of idea that if we do something bad, we should kind of expect to be punished for it. It's just the laws of the universe, right? This is just how kind of things go. Sometimes that balance isn't so much cosmic as it is legal. If I do something bad to you, then you can take me to court and get just compensation for that. Just compensation. Back to this idea of justice. Sometimes it's even smaller than that. It's not cosmic. It's not on the level of a nation state or a justice system or anything like that. It's very, very personal. If I show up to your party, it would be quite rude of me not to bring something like a bottle of wine along, just to demonstrate a little bit of equivalent exchange. You have invited me to your party, and so I am showing up with something for you. Equivalent exchange balance. The universal harmony is restored. All of this is reciprocal. It's an equal and equivalent exchange. And at the heart of this is that word, right? Exchange. Graeber talks about exchange theory, and he quotes Claude Lévi-Strauss, one of the OG, the most influential anthropologists out there. Lévi-Strauss talked about the three spheres of exchange. There is language, which is the exchange of words. You can kind of get this exchange of ideas, this interchange, all of this from the exchange of words, which makes up our language. There is also, very weirdly, kinship, which he says is the exchange of women. Fair enough. And of course, the economy, which is the exchange of things, goods and services going back and forth. These might seem a little bit ridiculous, especially the idea of kinship being the exchange of women. That to our modern ears might not make all that much sense. But many of our legal codes and much of our moral philosophy and many of our theories of justice boil down to exactly that. There's underpinning all of these. It kind of boils down, or baked into the system or in the bedrock, whatever metaphor you prefer, is the idea of reciprocity. And you can kind of pick your example. If you're a fan of philosophy, you can go back to the Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle, for example, whose ideas of justice, particularly narrow justice, which is the personal as opposed to kind of the broad legal justice, but his narrow version of justice is all about kind of equality and proportionality, the idea of, again, reciprocity, underpinning a lot of Aristotle's ideas of morality and justice. The idea of balance and the mean between two extremes comes up quite a bit with Aristotle, without getting too deeply into it, but balance is a big deal for Aristotle. You could also look at some of the sort of classical moral philosophers, people like Immanuel Kant, who takes this kind of abstract reciprocity and tries to boil it down into maxims, and from those maxims you can derive universal laws. It's an attempt to kind of rationalize our ideas, our feelings of reciprocity into something that could be a lot more scientific. This is what Kant is kind of consumed with for most of his life. You can also look at somebody like Thomas Hobbes, who we'll meet later in this book when we get into theories of money and currency later on, or somebody like John Locke, who also is going to come up quite a bit later on in this book, who were a little more, let's say, flexible than Kant, but still, for people like Hobbes and Locke, and of course Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the idea of justice and morality is based on some kind of a contract. Justice is a bargain. It's a deal, an exchange between the governed and the governors. It is a reciprocal relationship between sovereign and citizen, in other words. And listen, the study of justice is an enormous and a broad field. I think you can read notions of reciprocity into some of the more modern philosophers, especially John Rawls, who tries to kind of derive a system of justice based on an original position. But there's a lot more to this. But I think a lot of our modern morality and justice does kind of boil down to this idea of reciprocity. All of this is to say that we've arrived at a point in our society where we feel intuitively and instinctively that justice is about reciprocal exchange. That is to say, justice is reciprocity, in other words. But is it? David Graeber comes here and tells us that we bake reciprocity into the core of everything that we do because we are forcing the idea of balance. But If you look around you in the real world, things are a lot more complicated. So you can absolutely base your moral codes and your moral understanding on an idea of exchange, bake reciprocity into this. But he gives us two other alternatives to this. They're basically two different poles that could guide our real life moral principles, which we kind of constantly shift between, is what he says. The two poles that he gives us here are communism and hierarchy. Two other ways, in other words, of organizing our economic relations that are not based on exchange. Now, you may look at this and say, okay, this it sounds a little bit overly simplistic. This might be doing a little bit too much boiling down into two very extreme extremes. And he does kind of acknowledge that, but it does make sense to start with these as kind of our polar opposites and then kind of frame the discussion around these three different possibilities: communism, exchange, and hierarchy. Let's go ahead and break it down. Now, let's start with communism. Now, communism, Graeber says, is defined by Marx's famous maxim, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. Now, we have talked about this many times before on this series. We'll talk about it many times again. But very briefly, this idea is if you can contribute more, you contribute more. And if somebody needs more, they take more. That's roughly the idea of communism. Graeber, by the way, has this whole aside at the start of this chapter where he talks about communism having come to mean something that is a little bit more mythic, kind of utopian, right? We do this revolution and we arrive at some kind of Edenic paradise of communism. But really, Graeber says, people abide by communistic principles all the time, in almost every aspect of their daily lives. And I'm willing to bet that you yourself watching this video have engaged in these communistic principles several times. You might actually do a little bit more of it because you're watching an anarchist channel in the beginning, so this is probably a little more baked into your life than most. But I'm willing to bet that there are little things that you might not have noticed yourself doing that, if you take a closer look, have nothing to do with reciprocity and exchange, and much more to do with kind of a communistic spirit of from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. We frequently do things for others without expecting any kind of payment back. Graeber gives us a very simple example, which is somebody asks you to pass them that wrench. Are you going to think through this? Or are you going to ask, what's in it for you? Or are you just going to kind of hand them the wrench? This is an action. It's a very simple action, but it is something that you are doing, a service for somebody else, where reciprocity doesn't even come into it. This is what Graeber calls baseline communism. He says it's there in every aspect of life, and it boils down to this very simple idea, which is if the need is great enough and the cost is reasonable enough, then communist principles prevail. That is to say, if the need is great enough, for example, somebody is out there drowning, you are probably going to step in and save them without having to worry about, I need to get something out of this scenario. I need something from them in order for me to save their life. No, the need is incredibly great. And so I must go. It is within my means, my capabilities, and their need is incredibly great. And so I must go and save them. That is very, very clear anti-reciprocity communistic thinking. In a similar vein, Graeber gives us the example of, two smokers, and one of them asks the other for a cigarette. You're probably just going to hand over the cigarette. It's a very reasonable demand. So if the need is great enough, or if the request is reasonable enough, chances are you're going to abide by those communistic principles. And we see expressions of this all the time. Graeber talks about, for example, in times of a natural disaster, people will typically revert to, he calls them rough and ready communist principles. You also see these very clearly at work in societies or communities that put a lot of emphasis on hospitality. There's not a lot of reciprocity being asked for. It's just a group ethic that when a stranger visits your town, you provide for them, you treat them well. And then, of course, your classic examples, any kind of volunteer activity, a sports league, a soup kitchen, all of this is operating on communistic principles. You are not expecting any kind of classic give and take in a reciprocal exchange-based moral code. You're just kind of giving up your time because that's what you do. Graeber says, communism is the foundation of all human sociability. It is what makes society possible. There is always an assumption that anyone who is not an enemy can be expected to act on the principle of from each according to their abilities, at least to an extent. For example, if one needs to figure out how to get somewhere and the other person knows the way. Graeber is very quick to note as well that even in commerce, right, even in the capitalistic economy that we live in, this principle is still very much at play. You will see in cases of, for example, shopkeepers who are from the local area, they will often reduce prices for those who are in need from their own community. When you are in the community and understand the needs of the community, cold capitalist logic and calculus typically just kind of falls away. And by the way, if you ask me, that's why they keep introducing automatic checkout machines. They drive me absolutely insane. Anyway, we'll strip our humanity away and mechanize it as much as possible. That's great, and it's not going to lead to any consequences down the road. It's totally fine. But that's communism. That's one extreme. The other extreme is hierarchy. And in hierarchy, reciprocity may also just fall away. So, exchange requires formal equality between two individuals, right? In order to engage in exchange, people must start from a position of being roughly equal, or at least that's the baseline assumption. But when you introduce hierarchy, that becomes a bit of a problem because people aren't really equals. And so the equal exchange, this sort of level footing that you have to have from the start, it starts to kind of crumble. Graeber gives us the really interesting example of the king. He spends a lot of time in this chapter when he's talking about exchange, talking about gifts and the various nuances that go along with gift exchange in various contexts, in various cultures, and in various situations and scenarios. And one of the scenarios that he talks about is giving a gift to the king. If you operate by the rules of reciprocity and exchange, if I give you a gift, then I should expect a gift back that is of equal value, roughly. But how do you give a gift to a king? Well, you really don't. The king has everything. The king, by definition, is above everyone else. There is no gift that you can give to a king that he doesn't already have. And if you give the king something that he doesn't already have, it could be perceived as an insult, which is, by the way, a really big problem. Graeber gives the example of a glassmaker who's made an unbreakable glass in Rome, takes it to the emperor, and the emperor asks if he's told anybody else how to make this unbreakable piece of glass that the emperor has never seen before. And when the man says no, he hasn't told anybody else, he has the man executed so that nobody can replicate that glass technology. It's tough giving gifts to kings. Anyway, hierarchy is the opposite of reciprocity. Stuff flows from the bottom up. So from subordinates to superiors. We occasionally have a tendency to think of things like feudal society as a type of exchange. So we often think, well, okay, the lord protects the serfs and the serfs feed the lord. That is a type of reciprocal exchange. But then when you look a little closer at that, that's not what's going on at all. The serfs or underlings or knights or whatever is beneath the lord are the ones who are protecting the lord. The lord isn't actually doing the protecting himself. And so the lord is getting both protection from his underlings and support and food from those underlings. What really is the Lord providing? Very, very little. All of this stuff flows upwards. And Graeber adds another really interesting dimension to this because he says when those gifts flow upwards, they have a tendency to become custom. So if one year a peasant gives a gift, a particular thing to the king, the next year he better expect to give that same gift again. Gifts become customs. Those customary arrangements turn into things like castes, which then become racialized. They become kind of baked into a new and more intense hierarchy. And so this is a very, very natural development. Why? Because we are sorting ourselves into different sorts of people. There is no equivalent exchange. These are not equals on equal footing. This is master and subordinates. This is lord and serf. This is anyone in the rungs of the caste system along the way. We have sorted ourselves into fundamentally different people, and there literally can be no reciprocity when that is the situation. So hierarchy, in other words, is a model that's not based on reciprocity, but on extraction. And that is the complete opposite of reciprocity. So, okay, we have communism, we have hierarchy, and exchange as three wildly different moral principles. Three systems, in other words, from which to derive our moral principles. Where does all of this leave us? Well, it leaves us constantly shifting between the three. Graeber says, listen, we are communists with our close friends and feudal lords with our children. We imagine that reciprocity is at the heart of our moral codes and our justice system and the ways that we act towards others. Really, reality, the real world is incredibly messy. In practice, we are constantly shifting back and forth between these different modes, between communism and hierarchy and exchange, and we are trying to look backwards and impose reciprocity on all of these interactions and say, well, okay, we're trying to rationalize what we've done in terms of reciprocity, but that really isn't reciprocal at all. I'm willing to bet you've actually already tried to do that. As I've been explaining this stuff, you may have said, well, okay, in the case of, my friend wants a cigarette, I give them the cigarette because I expect to eventually get a cigarette back. Or you might say, well, in the case of the drowning person, if I save somebody from drowning, I do get something from that. Maybe I get the sense of moral superiority. I get a little bit of something for myself. But take another look at those, because that's not reciprocal at all. On the one hand, the cigarette example, that is not an equal exchange between different people. You may not get that cigarette back. You may not eventually get a cigarette. It may take some time to get a cigarette back. You might get it from somebody else. And then in terms of the person who is drowning, that moral feeling of superiority, which a lot of people, when they talk about morality, they feel the need to talk through this as if there is no such thing as a truly altruistic action. Fine, but that is not a reciprocal exchange. You are not getting something from that person. They are not giving anything up so that you can have it. That is just all purely internal. The altruistic argument was a little bit of a separate thing. And then Graeber talks about the communities themselves as well, and talks about the ways that extremely hierarchical relationships may often shift into communism. Think, for example, of the incredibly wealthy patron who supports an artist unconditionally. The artist may produce something that would be good for the patron, something with their name on it that'll make them feel happy, but a lot of the time it's just a general giving something to someone else, and that is an intense amount of hierarchy that tends to break down a little bit with the patron relationship. There are also communist societies that will start to form hierarchies because of differences in ability. And Graeber talks about, in a really interesting section, the way that some egalitarian societies, especially the Inuit in Greenland is the example he pulls here, will make fun of an incredibly skillful and prideful hunter, right? An incredibly skilled hunter who may rise in the hierarchy, but because you make so much fun of them and they have to self-deprecate and everything, you knock them down a peg or two. That's kind of baked into the system. And therefore, when we look around ourselves and at just general life, it's much, much messier. We can't really talk in terms of exchange and reciprocity when we are talking about human morality and the interactions that make us human. Our shared humanity is not based on exchange and reciprocity. In fact, it might be based on something much more subtle, more nuanced, more complex than the system that Immanuel Kant was trying to describe with his maxims. And all of this brings us to the final question here, which is, so what is debt? Well, debt is a relationship between two people who should be equals, but are in a state of inequality that could be set right. What the heck does that mean? Well, we've already said that we assume that justice is based on equal exchange, right? Equal exchange requires a starting position of equality. Of course, one person may be wealthier than the other, but at the end of the day, they are both human beings. Neither owes the other anything. One person will ask the other person for something. When they get that something, they enter into a state of inequality. That is to say, the debtor owes something to the creditor, and for the entire period of that loan, for as long as they owe something to the creditor, they are subservient to the creditor. They are a lesser person. There is no reciprocity during this period during which the debt is unpaid. Then the debt is paid, and they return to a position of equality. So that is Graeber's definition of debt, right? Two people who should be equals entering into a situation of inequality that can be set right. Now, our assumption here, and this is a very important assumption, is that at the beginning of this exchange, they were equals. And therefore, if something goes wrong and that debt is not paid, it is the fault of the debtor. They could have made things right. Right? It's there in the definition. They started as equals. They owed each other nothing. The debtor entered into this relationship of their own cognizance, and still the debt is unpaid. So it must be the fault of the debtor. They could have made things right, but they didn't. And that must be because they are lazy or stupid or something bad in some way. And so debt is ultimately an expression of the way that we center reciprocity and exchange. You and I know that it is not always the fault of the debtor, that many, many things are at play here. We talked about the example of nation states at the beginning. We've talked, about the ways that people are forced to enter into debt agreements. In many, many scenarios, we know that there's a lot more complexity that goes into it, but this is what underlies our thinking, our moral and justice-oriented thinking. And so is it any surprise that we are so biased against debtors in basically every situation? We always assume that it is the fault of the debtor for not being able to get themselves out of this situation. Reciprocity and exchange is baked into everything that we do, and Graeber says that debt is the foundation of a middle-class morality, and not in a good way. Without debt, as per this understanding, if we assume that exchange and reciprocity are at the core of everything, without debt, we are nothing to each other. And that's why Graeber says every time we say please or thank you, which is if you please and I am obliged to you, we are always expressing obligations or debts, a shared humanity based on mutual obligation and debt. There is nothing fundamental about exchange and reciprocity, but we treat it as if there is something deeply fundamental, as if this is the core of our humanity. And because of that, we have made debt completely essential to human life, to social interactions, to shared experiences. And that is desperately sad. And we will talk much more about this throughout the course of the rest of these videos that I'm going to make and throughout the rest of this book. But I am really glad that we've laid the foundation. Next week, I'll be talking about sex, death, honor, and degradation, chapters 6 and 7. So tune in for that. And please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. Check out the Patreon channel, patreon.com/Champagne Anarchism. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.